The truth about God's 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, originally found in the Old Testament, Exodus 21-17 and Deuteronomy 5:6-21, serve as a fundamental guide to moral living in the Judeo-Christian tradition. These commandments form the core of God's law, outlining humanity's duties toward God and fellow people. In the New Testament, while the specific commands are reiterated, Jesus and the apostles emphasize the deeper spiritual principles behind them, focusing on love, integrity, and inner transformation. By comparing the Old and New Testament teachings, we see how the commandments are not abolished but fulfilled and expanded through Christ's teachings, calling for a heart-oriented obedience rooted in love for God and neighbor. The comparison of the Old Testament and the New Testament regarding the 10 Commandments reveals how the moral principles in the Old Testament law are reaffirmed and expanded in the New Testament, particularly through the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. Here's a side-by-side comparison of each commandment with its New Testament counterpart or interpretation. 1. You shall have no other gods before me. New Testament, Matthew 4:10. Worship the Lord your God and serve him only. New Testament teaching, Jesus emphasizes exclusive worship of God, consistent with the first commandment. 2. Old Testament, Exodus 24-6. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath. New Testament, 1 John 5:21. Dear children, keep yourselves from idols. New Testament teaching, idolatry is condemned, whether it involves physical idols or anything else that takes God's place in a believer's heart. 3. Old Testament, Exodus 27. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. New Testament, Matthew 6:9. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. New Testament teaching, the emphasis is on honoring God's name in prayer and speech, keeping reverence for him central. 4. Old Testament, Exodus 28-11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. New Testament, Mark 2:27. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. New Testament teaching, Jesus focuses on the intent of the Sabbath, rest and reflection, rather than strict legalistic observance. Christians often see the fulfillment of the Sabbath rest in Christ, Hebrews 4:9-10. 5. Old Testament, Exodus 20:12. Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land. New Testament, Ephesians 6:1-2. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. New Testament teaching. Paul reaffirms the importance of honoring parents, expanding it to include both physical and spiritual blessings. 6. Old Testament, Exodus 20:13. You shall not murder. New Testament, Matthew 5:21-22. You have heard it said, you shall not murder. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. New Testament teaching. Jesus deepens the command by addressing the root of murder, anger and hatred, showing that the commandment extends to heart attitudes, not just actions. 7. Old Testament, Exodus 20:14. You shall not commit adultery. New Testament, Matthew 5:27-28. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. New Testament teaching, Jesus extends the commandment to include not just the act of adultery, but also lustful thoughts, emphasizing purity in both heart and behavior. 8. Old Testament, Exodus 20:15. You shall not steal. New Testament, Ephesians 4:28. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work doing something useful with their own hands. New Testament teaching. Paul encourages not only refraining from theft, but also engaging in honest work, highlighting personal responsibility and generosity. 9. Old Testament, Exodus 20:16. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. New Testament, Ephesians 4:25. Each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. New Testament teaching, speaking the truth in love and honesty is central to Christian relationships, reinforcing the call to reject lying and deceit. 10. Old Testament, Exodus 20:17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, wife, servant, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. New Testament, Luke 12:15. Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance. New Testament teaching, Jesus warns against greed and coveting, teaching that true life is not found in material possessions, but in a relationship with God. Conclusion. Old Testament versus New Testament. The Old Testament provides the Ten Commandments as the foundational moral law, focused on specific behaviors and practices. In the New Testament, these commandments are reinterpreted and deepened by Jesus and the apostles. While the moral principles remain the same, the New Testament emphasizes the spirit behind the law, love for God and others, and extends the commandments to include not just outward actions, but also inner attitudes such as anger, lust, and greed. The New Testament teachings bring a greater focus on love and inner transformation, fulfilling the law through the example and grace of Jesus Christ.